Hello everybody, I am Anu Priya, Assistant Professor in Rai University. Today we will continue with the lecture series of Transfer of Property Act 1872. So let's start with the lecture series. So in this lecture we will continue with the section 19 of Transfer of Property Act, which deals with vested interest. Vested interest is defined under section 19 of Transfer of Property Act. In this section, we have to understand at first what the term vested and contingent basically means. So the term vested interest means that to bestow some rights. That right is absolute right, and that there is certainty that that event will happen, must happen, and the right will transfer or the interest will transfer to one person to another person. Whereas in contingent interest, what actually happen, at first you have to understand that contingent interest is not a type of interest. It is actually depend upon the situation. If that particular event happen, then the transfer of interest will continue. But if the event does not happen, happening and non-happening of the event, that means that it actually depends upon the chance. There is a chance that might be interest will transfer and might not the interest will transfer. So that is what we call contingent interest. And in vested interest, there is absolute probability that the interest will transfer to the particular person. So if we take an example of it, the example for vested interest is that, for example, A is a person and he wanted to transfer his property to B, but that transaction will happen in the future. For example, maybe 2 to 3 months. After 2 to 3 months, that property will transfer to B. So what is actually happening is that after 3 months, this is the probability the 3 months will pass, and this is the probability that the property will transfer after 3 months. So this is certainty that interest in future will transfer to particular person B. So this is vested interest. So B's right over that property is a vested interest right. So now we will deal with the section entirely, whereon the transfer of property and interest therein is created in the favor of a person without specifying the time when it is to take effect. So if in a case of transaction of the property or conveyance of the property, the time limit was not specified that at what time the effect will continue, the effect will start, or in the term is specifying. So here it is what, if there is no specifying time, or after that, या फिर in terms specifying that it is to take effect forthwith. What the next line is actually talking about is that future transaction forthwith. So if the property transaction, the interest transaction will be in future forthwith, or on the happening of an event which must happen, or what if the event, it depends upon the event to happen, but that event which must happen, there is no chance that that event may happen or may not happen, there is certainty that event must happen. Such interest is vested interest. Then in that case, that interest will be called as vested interest. Unless a contrary intention appear from the terms of the transfer, a vested interest is not defeated by the death of the transferee before he obtains possession. So this line actually talks about the exception clause, unless or subject to that contrary intention appears according to the circumstances of the transfer. That is other thing. And the other is the vested interest is not defeated by the death of the transferee. So if in case of transfer, the earlier example which what I have already told you, that in case A wanted to transfer B the property after 3 months, that is future transaction, that is vested interest. In case B dies, so even though the B dies, that does not mean their right in the property is defeated. Maybe the heirs of the B will acquire that right. So this is what it's called, that the right is not defeated, the interest is not defeated by death of the transferee before he obtains the possession. Maybe the B does not obtain the possession will be obtained by the B after 3 months, but the interest will be certain, the interest will be vested interest. So there are some explanation of it, that an intention that an interest shall not be vested is not to be inferred merely from the provision whereby the enjoyment thereof is postponed. So this explanation clause is basically exception of this section 19 of the Transfer of Property Act. So what the first exception is, an intention that an interest shall not be vested is not to be inferred merely from the provisions whereby the enjoyment thereof is postponed. So if the enjoyment of the property, that the property belongs to B and the B will obtain the possession of it, so obtaining the possession is kind of enjoyment of that property. By obtaining the possession, the B will be able to enjoy the property according to his will. So what is this? If the enjoyment is postponed, what we have already read, that future transaction is valid, future transaction is vested interest. So if 3 months is postponed, the enjoyment is postponed to 3 months. So in that case also, it is not defeated. The vested interest will be there. Or next is whereby a prior interest in the same property is given or reserved for some other person. So if there is an option, let us understand it with an example. Example which I have already earlier given to you when we were reading, when we were actually explaining and learning about the unborn person. So if you want to transfer the property to an unborn person, you have to create a life interest. So if what is life interest? For example, A wants to transfer a property to an unborn person. For example, let be X. So, for transferring the property to unborn person, this is not possible until and unless you transfer it to another living person. So, A transfer it to the father of X, B, as a life interest. So, B have a life interest over that property, and after B, the property will transfer to X, the unborn person. So, over here, what is actually happening? B is taking the interest, that is life interest. So if we create a life interest over that property, then also the interest will not defeat. The interest will be a vested interest. So X, who is unborn person, he have a vested interest over that property. So next is where the income arising from the property is directed to be accumulated until the time of enjoyment arise, or from the provision that if the particular event shall happen, the interest shall pass to another person. So over here there are two more exception of this clause. First is that if a property is transferred, if a property is directed to be transferred, accumulation until, we have read about the accumulation is section 17 of the Transfer of Property Act. But for your understanding, let me tell you what is accumulation basically is. To collect something, A transfer the property to B. Alright, so what is actually happening, that he put the condition to be that the income of this property will be accumulated and granted for the maintenance of the property. For example 10% of the income over from the property will be transferred for the maintenance of that particular building. So what is actually happening? So if there is some direction of accumulation, let's take another example. In that case, the accumulation income should be transferred to the son of the transferor, for maintenance, for example. So what is actually happening, that interest is restrained for some time. The accumulation of that income is actually transferring to the son of the transferor. So this is also over here, that directed to be accumulated until the time of enjoyment. Enjoyment time does not arrive. For example, A have put in a condition that you have to maintain my son from that accumulation of the property for next 5 years. So until 5 years get over, the accumulation will go to the son of B. So what is actually happening here, that B have the possession, but he is accumulating the interest, the income from the property, and accumulating it and transferring it to the son of the transferor. So what is actually happening, the enjoyment time will arrive after 5 years, but this does not defeat the interest of the B. So that 5 years will be over and B will have the complete possession on that property. So this is vested interest on that particular property. The next exception is, or from the provision that if the particular event shall happen, the interest shall pass to another person. So if you put a condition that A transfer the property to B, and put it the condition that if B does not get married or does not get graduated at 25 years, for suppose. So what is actually happening, that if he will not graduate at the age of 25, the property will transfer to Z. So over here, the interest of B depends upon the graduation case. But even though the condition is there, but that condition will must happen. That event is must happen. So the interest of in that property, B's interest will be vested interest, whereas the Z interest, which depends upon the chance of acquiring that interest if B does not graduated at the age of 25. So Z interest will be contingent interest. So let's move to the another section. Section 20. Section 20 of Transfer of Property Act deals with when unborn person acquire vested interest on transfer for his benefit. So we have read that property can be transferred to unborn person, but when that interest will arise, when that that unborn person acquire vested interest on that property. So by this section you can understand that the interest on that property will start by the birth of the unborn person. But that does not means that the property will be in the possession of unborn person, but the interest will start. So what is this? Where on the transfer of property an interest there is created for the benefit of a person not then living, means unborn. He acquires upon his birth unless a contrary intention appears. So what when he acquires? Acquires upon his birth. Unless a contrary intention appears from the term of the transfer, a vested interest, although he may not entitled to enjoy, therefore the immediately on his birth. So he will not able to enjoy that property at the birth, on the birth of that unborn person, but he will acquire the vested interest on the property by his birth only. The next slide we will dealing with contingent interest. So we have already learned what contingent interest basically is. So let us just focus on the particular provisions of Transfer of Property Act regarding contingent interest. Whereon a transfer of property and interest therein is created in the favor of a person to take effect only on the happening of a specified uncertain event, or if the specified uncertain event shall not happen. So if the probability of acquiring the interest depends upon the chance of happening of a certain event or non-happening of a certain event. When it appears to be happening of certain event, for example, A said to B that if India wants the match, then the property will be transferred to you. Then what is that? India might want, India might not want. So over here it depends upon happening of certain event. So for example, non-happening of the event, another example of non-happening event is that A said to B that if the cargo does not reach, then I will indemnify you. So if it depends upon the indemnify process will depend upon if the cargo will not reach, not happening of an event. So this chance will depend upon contingency. So this is what contingent interest is about. Such person thereby acquires a contingent interest in the property. Such interest becomes a vested interest in the former case on happening of the event, and latter case when the happening of the event becomes impossible. So in the previous example, if that event happened, India may win. Then in that case, that interest which was contingent earlier will become vested interest, and if the interest will depend upon non-happening of the event, that example was if the cargo does not reach, and that thing happened, the cargo does not reached. So what will happen? The previous contingent interest will now become vested interest. The exceptions over here is where under transfer of property a person become entitled to an interested therein upon attaining a particular age, and the transferor also gives him absolute the income to arise from such interest become he reaches that age, or indicates the income or of such thereof as may be necessary to be applied for his benefit, such interest is not contingent interest. If the contingency will depend upon particular age, for example, A transfer his property to B and with the condition that B at the age of 18 will acquire that property. So what is this? The contingency depend upon the age. That particular age will reach. We will not assume that we might die. We will take it that he will alive and he will reach that age, and that interest will be vested interest and will not take at contingent interest. So the next slide. Transfer to the member of a class who attain a particular age. Whereon a transfer of property and interest therein is created in the favor of such member only of class as shall attain a particular age. So this section also deals with particular age thing. Such interest does not vest in any member of the class who has not attended that age. Here we take some example that a particular person wants to transfer his property to 233 person. For example, there is a person named as X. He wanted to transfer his property to two sons, maybe S1 and S2. He wanted to transfer to S1 and S2. So when S1 reached the age, particular age which is set was 21. S1 reached the age of 21, but S2 is still of 17 years. So S1 will acquire the property as soon as he reached the 21, and S2 will not acquire it. When S2 will reach the 21, he will acquire that property. This is simply what section 22 talks about. Section 23. Transfer contingent on happening of specified uncertain event. So here we will deal with transfer contingent on happening of a specified uncertain event. We have already discussed about this section in a brief in the contingent transfer part, but over here we will read it again. Whereon a transfer of property and interest therein is to acquire to a specified person if specified uncertain event shall happen and no time is mentioned for the occurrence of that event, the interest fails unless such event happened before or at the same time the immediate or precedent interest cease to exist. So let us take another example that for example A transfer the property to an unborn person X and he created the life interest of B. So the X should born before the death of B because the property's life interest vested to B. So if B dies before before the unborn person get birth, so in that case that unspecified event does not happen and that transfer will automatically will cease to exist. That interest will cease to exist. Next is transfer to such person a certain person as to survive at some period of time. So if there is basically about the surviving of the person, there is a person for example there is a person named as A and he said that after me the property will transfer to C and D. For example, C and D, and the property will distribute equally among them. And D dies. Who is surviving? C. In that case, the whole property will transfer to C. This is what it is actually dealing with. Whoever will survive at that period of time, he will acquire that property automatically. So, thank you for the lecture of today. We'll continue with transfer of property.